Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And wow, you've really brought us a fascinating topic this time around. We're going to be diving into the historical accuracy of the Bible, a topic that has sparked, centuries of debate. And your research takes us on a really, really interesting journey through it all. So
Actually,
I think this will be a good one.
I'm excited.
Yeah. So you've been digging into some compelling arguments that really challenge the Catholic Church's role in the Bible's creation. And I have to say, you've unearthed some really thought-provoking stuff here. So we're going to unpack those arguments, follow the trail of evidence you've presented, and just see where it leads us. All right, so one of the things that really jumped out at me right away was how you use the King James Version of the Bible to sort of highlight these contradictions that you see with what you consider core Catholic doctrines. And you bring up some very specific examples, like the practice of calling priests father, right?
Right.
And how that seems to clash with Matthew 23:9, which says, "And call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven." It's a powerful connection to make.
Yeah, it's one of the things that first struck me as well when I was doing my own research.
Yeah.
Really got me thinking.
Yeah, and you didn't stop there. You pointed to other verses like 1 John 1:9 that emphasizes Jesus as the sole forgiver of sins. And that seems to directly challenge the Catholic practice of confession to a priest. It's almost like you're saying, hold on, if the Bible is the ultimate authority, then how do we reconcile these Catholic practices with what these verses are telling us?
Exactly. And it's a question that's been raised for centuries. And, this viewpoint that you're presenting really aligns with the Protestant Reformation, specifically with what's called the doctrine of sola fide.
Sola fide. Okay, now, I have to admit, I haven't spent a ton of time in, deep theological debates. Can you break that down for me and for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with the term?
Absolutely. Sola fide simply means faith alone.
Okay.
And it's the belief held by many Protestants that salvation comes solely through faith in Jesus Christ and not through good works or rituals like confession. And this was a central point of contention during the Reformation, really distinguishing Protestant doctrines from Catholic teachings.
And speaking of the Reformation, you brought up the Council of Trent, which, if I'm remembering my history correctly, that's a pretty pivotal event in church history. And you mentioned it because the council essentially declared your belief in sola fide as anathema, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement, is it?
Not quite. It essentially means to denounce it as heresy.
Okay.
The Council of Trent, which was convened in the 16th century, was the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation.
Okay.
It sought to clarify and solidify Catholic doctrine, including its stance on justification and salvation.
And so to declare sola fide anathema really kind of highlights that deep theological divide that opened up during that period and continues to shape different branches of Christianity today. So in a way, your personal belief in sola fide puts you on one side of a centuries-old debate about the Bible's interpretation and authority. It's like you're tracing the fault lines of Christian history by examining these arguments. But you didn't stop at just the theological differences.
No.
You dug deeper into the actual journey of the Bible itself. And let me tell you, your research reads like a historical thriller.
Wow.
It's really something else. You start with Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the 4th century. And now most people know him as the first Christian Roman emperor, right? A pivotal figure. But you didn't just accept that narrative at face value. You really question how his reign and his potential influence might have shaped the early church's control over the Bible. And then from there, you take us through some turbulent times. The Albigenses, a group deemed heretical by the church. The Waldensians, risking it all to preserve those early biblical texts during the Dark Ages. And of course, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It's like each event raises the stakes in this struggle over the Bible's transmission and interpretation.
It's true. And what I think is so fascinating is how you've connected these seemingly disparate historical events into a narrative about the evolution of biblical authority. You're highlighting how power dynamics, political upheavals, even technological advancements have shaped the way we understand and relate to the Bible today.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about these historical figures in the abstract, but I'm really interested in how you connect their actions to this larger narrative about the Bible. For example, you started with Constantine. He's often hailed as this, pivotal figure who brought Christianity into the light, but you seem to approach his legacy with a bit more skepticism. What makes you question his role in the development of the Bible as we know it?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Constantine's conversion, while a turning point, it did usher in this era where Christianity went from being a persecuted faith to the dominant religion of the Roman Empire.
Right.
But as you pointed out, this transition wasn't always smooth or straightforward.
Yeah, you specifically questioned the idea of Constantine being considered the first pope,
Mm.
which now that you mention it is a label I've heard attached to him. But I mean,
Yeah.
why is that significant?
Well, it reveals a lot about how we view this relationship between political and religious power even today. The very concept of a pope, right?
Right.
This single figure claiming supreme authority in the church. That didn't really solidify until centuries after Constantine. In fact, early Christians debated fiercely about the nature of leadership within the church.
And that brings us right to the Albigenses, who, if I'm remembering your research correctly, had very different ideas about religious authority. They didn't just challenge the Pope. They seemed to question the entire structure of the church.
They absolutely did, and their story is a tragic example of how differing interpretations of the Bible could lead to persecution and violence.
Yeah.
The Albigenses, also known as Cathars, emphasized personal study and interpretation of the Bible over church doctrines. They rejected the authority of priests and bishops, believing that a direct connection with God was possible without these intermediaries.
And this emphasis on personal understanding of the Bible, that's something they shared with the Waldensians, right?
Exactly.
I was struck by how you highlighted their role in preserving biblical texts during a time when the church held such a tight grip on knowledge.
The Waldensians, facing persecution themselves, became almost accidental archivists.
Okay.
They recognized the power of the written word,
Mm.
and they understood that preserving these texts was essential, even if it meant risking their lives. And, we have to remember, this is happening centuries before the printing press.
Right.
Every copy of the Bible had to be meticulously copied by hand.
Wow.
It makes their efforts even more extraordinary.
It really highlights how the Bible's journey to us was anything but guaranteed. So many things could have gone wrong, so many texts lost or destroyed. And then, as if these religious conflicts weren't enough, you throw another twist into the story, the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Yeah.
I have to admit, when I first read this part of your research, I thought to myself, what does the fall of a city have to do with the Bible?
Hmm.
But you drew a fascinating connection.
It's a reminder that sometimes these historical events, seemingly unrelated, can have unintended consequences that just ripple through time in surprising ways.
Yeah.
And the fall of Constantinople, a major turning point in history, led to an exodus of scholars from the east to the west. And what were they carrying with them? Precious manuscripts, including biblical texts that had been preserved in the libraries of Constantinople.
So it's like this treasure trove of ancient knowledge suddenly arrives in Europe right at the cusp of the Renaissance.
Exactly.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is where your research on Erasmus and the different Bible versions really starts to get interesting.
It does, because this influx of manuscripts, particularly Greek texts, allowed scholars like Erasmus to compare them to the Latin Vulgate, which had been the standard Bible in Western Europe for centuries.
Yeah.
And this is where your example of penance versus repentance becomes so important.
That one-word change, as you pointed out, has huge implications. It's not just a linguistic detail. It gets to the heart of how people understood salvation and their relationship with God.
Exactly. Erasmus, by highlighting these discrepancies, wasn't just pointing out translation errors.
Right.
He was implicitly questioning the church's claim to have the sole infallible interpretation of the Bible.
And this questioning coincided with another monumental development that you highlighted, the invention of the printing press.
Right.
And that's a game changer, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Leslie, the Bible isn't just something chained to a pulpit, accessible only to a select few who could read Latin.
Right.
It's being translated into languages people understand, being printed, distributed, debated. It's like you said earlier, the stakes have been raised again. But this time, it's not just about theological arguments or power struggles within the church. It's about the very nature of knowledge and who gets to control it.
And that takes us right up to the King James Version, which you focused on, and its role in shaping how we understand the Bible today. But before we jump into that, I think it's important to just pause and acknowledge the sheer audacity of your research. You're not just accepting the simplistic narrative about the Bible's history. You're digging deep, you're connecting the dots, you're uncovering a story that's far more complex and, frankly, far more interesting than I think most people realize.
It is a complex story, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating. We often think of the Bible as this fixed, unchanging text, but like you've shown us, it's been shaped by centuries of translation, interpretation, even power struggles. And speaking of the King James Version, I'm curious how it fits into this bigger picture that you've painted for us. It's the version you use in your research, so it clearly holds some significance for you. What makes it stand out from all the other translations out there?
Well, the King James Version was commissioned in the early 1600s, and it arrived at this really pivotal moment. Printing had taken hold, right? Enabling much wider access to the Bible than ever before, but it also met this proliferation of translations, some more accurate than others, and some with, overt political or theological
Right.
agendas.
Right.
King James I, he sought a definitive English translation, one that was both majestic in language but also true to the original texts.
So it wasn't just a vanity project. He genuinely wanted to get closer to the real Bible, so to speak.
Exactly. And I think this is where your research on earlier figures like Erasmus becomes so crucial. The King James translators, they didn't work in a vacuum. They benefited from generations of scholarship, comparing different manuscripts, debating the meaning of words, all in pursuit of this faithful rendering. I mean, your penance versus repentance example perfectly illustrates the weight of those choices.
Yeah.
The King James translators, informed by those debates, ultimately went with repentance. And it was a decision that shaped how countless people have understood that really pivotal concept.
It's incredible when you lay it all out like this to see how all these threads connect, how one translation builds upon the work of those who came before. But I have to admit, you took a turn I wasn't expecting when you connected these ancient texts to modern physics.
Oh, hush.
Well, I think it was the sheer audacity of it. Comparing the Big Bang Theory to the Kabbalistic concept of Ein Sof, both of which in their own ways challenge a literal reading of the Genesis creation account.
Yeah.
And it made me wonder if you were suggesting that science and ancient mysticism were somehow converging on a new understanding of the universe.
That's a really profound question, and one that I think reflects this yearning that many people feel to reconcile their scientific understanding with their spiritual longing. The Big Bang Theory, this idea describing the universe's origins, it can evoke a sense of awe and wonder that resonates with some of these mystical descriptions of creation emanating from a single point.
And then you brought in quantum physics with those experiments that suggest that consciousness might actually influence reality, which you connected to Kabbalah.
Yeah.
Were you suggesting that modern science was actually starting to validate these ancient mystical beliefs?
I think your research reflects this desire to find a unified view of reality, one where science and spirituality aren't at odds with each other, but rather different lenses through which we can view these same profound mysteries. It's tempting to draw those direct lines between quantum phenomena and these mystical concepts, but it's crucial to remember that these are distinct realms of inquiry, each with their own language and their own methods.
So maybe it's less about proving one with the other and more about just recognizing that the human search for meaning takes many forms, whether it's through scientific exploration, religious faith, or even, those personal experiences like the one you shared about the voice and the fish.
That story, deeply personal and moving, really speaks to the power of lived experience to shape our beliefs. You didn't arrive at your faith through abstract arguments alone, but through this direct encounter that resonated with something deep within you. And that, I think, is something that both science and religion ultimately seek. To make sense of our place in this vastness of existence, to connect with something larger than ourselves.
You've given me, and I'm sure everyone listening, a lot to think about. You've shown us that the Bible, far from being this static text, is really a living document, shaped by human hands, interpreted in countless ways, and yet still capable of speaking to us across millennia. You challenged us to question assumptions, to seek out those connections, and to really approach these big questions with both intellectual rigor and an open heart. And that, I think, is the true spirit of a deep dive. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions and never stop exploring.